Okay, so what is a labor union? Well, I kind of already brought this up in the competition lecture. A labor union, when you strip it of all the emotions and rhetoric that surrounds it, is nothing more than a cartel of labor at a particular workplace or in a particular industry. See, when we speak of labor markets in terms of supply and demand, it is the employee who is the producer and the employer who is the consumer. Because it's the employee that provides a service, their work, in exchange for payment in cash. And likewise, whenever a group of producers get together to act like a monopoly, they are not a literal monopoly because there's more than one of them, but they're acting like a monopoly because they're plotting with each other to rig the price, to rig the quantity that they produce. We call that a cartel. And so we can basically import all of our monopoly supply and demand analysis over to labor unions because it is simply another application of monopoly. However, there is more that we could say about this. For example, one difference between a monopoly on the production of goods, like, say, US Steel back in the day, versus a monopoly of labor, like, say, with a steelworkers union, is that with the union, people do not want to lose their own jobs. With US Steel, if they cut back their output, there's no potential harm to them. There's a trade-off, right? There's a trade-off between the profits of a higher price and the profits of more sales. But the firm is going to choose the optimal level of both so that it maximizes profit. With a union, on the other hand, there's a real concern about how the quantity of work is going to be reduced. Is it going to be reduced by reducing the amount of hours that we work? Or is it going to be reduced by reducing the number of workers? And you can see that in general, a union is going to have very strong preferences for the former. Nobody would want to unionize if they believed there was a chance that they might lose their job. So, a union is usually going to try to preserve existing jobs. But this is merely going to shift the unemployment off of them and onto other people. See, if you're an employer and you are thinking about expanding your workforce, one of the questions you're going to ask yourself is, how hard is it going to be to get rid of these people if I don't need them any longer? What if this worker turns out to be bad? What if this worker is unreliable? Or what if demand falls in the future? Or for some other reason, I want to cut back output. But I have a powerful union that says that I can't do that. They've made me sign a contract with them. They've made me make an agreement with them that I cannot fire a union member without certain conditions being met. Well, then you could find yourself in a situation where you don't want this worker. This worker is lowering your profits by being there because they don't add more to your production than they take in wages, and yet you're stuck with them. Well, unions greatly increase the risk of this happening. So do other kinds of workers' rights regulations. And so we would expect that the way employers will respond is by being much more selective about who they employ and by being much more cautious about expanding their business. And so the employment rate of people who already are in the union or who have connections to the union is going to go up. their job security is going to be improved at the same time that their working conditions and their pay is also improved. But the unemployment rate of people outside of the union is going to go down. And in general, you would expect it to go down by more than the job security of unionized workers will go up. In the typical supply and demand analysis, we don't really distinguish between different types of producers and different types of consumers. All we would say is just that the monopoly hurts the consumer, benefits the producer, but only by hurting the consumer, and lowers trade. In the case of a labor union, it's going to have a more complex redistributive effect where it too only benefits the union by harming the producer, but also by harming other workers who are not, other potential workers, I should say, who are excluded from the market because of the union's existence. And of course, the consumer as well, the final purchaser of whatever good is being made. Because the operating cost is going to be higher, and so you expect goods produced by a unionized industry to be more expensive. Now, we might also speak a bit more about why you would want to have a union. Now, the basic idea that it raises pay, that much is clear. But why would unions be especially common, even if other types of cartels are not? And part of it comes down to that they're legally tolerated. Cartels are usually banned, but if you form a cartel over labor, that's A-OK in this country. With good reasons, too. Well, labor unions have an especially important role to play in sort of balancing market power. Because you have this problem. As a rule, an individual worker needs their job far more than their employer needs them. That individual worker has to make a living. They have to be able to put food on their table and pay their rent. And even if conditions get worse, they can't just walk away and into another job as a rule. This kind of came up in the inflation lectures when we talked about sticky prices. This idea that although all markets eventually equilibrate, some markets equilibrate faster than others, and the market for labor is one of the slowest markets out there. Because again, employers want to vet the people they employ. They don't want to sink resources into training someone who turns out to be useless, especially if they might actually turn out to be, say, a thief or, dangerously incompetent. They end up breaking machinery. They end up screwing up orders because they don't know how to fill out the paperwork properly. For the employer, hiring someone is a much higher stake decision than buying a good is for a consumer. You buy something you don't like at the grocery store or at Walmart, it's okay. You're not out too much. You know not to do it again. But the producer can really get boned by a bad decision like that. This adds a great deal of friction to the process. And then you also add in the problem of information. Because you don't just walk into the job store and get a job for yourself. People have to look for openings. They have to look for openings that are suitable to them. There is a great deal. You will have a homework. Actually, I think it's probably in your Unit 3 homework, but there will be a homework that deals with different types of unemployment. We have what's called frictional unemployment, which is just the natural unemployment that results from people not being able to immediately find a job. You have this problem that You have job openings, you have people that are looking for jobs that could fill the opening, and yet they just don't know of each other's existence. And depending on what kind of industry it is and just sheer luck, it could take days, it could take weeks. For some people, it takes months to find a replacement job that's suitable. And when you go back to that problem that the employee needs the job to make a living, but the employer doesn't need them, this means that you're going to have a relatively elastic demand for labor, but you're going to have a very inelastic supply of labor. Now, the resulting equilibrium is not considered inefficient. It's just a reflection of reality, but it does heavily favor the employer over the employee. But imagine, what if it was not a worker who was negotiating with their boss, a worker who's easily replaceable, a worker who can just be fired and swapped out for someone else? What if it was instead all of the workers together, or at least some large critical mass of workers? Enough workers that even if they can't get a pure monopoly, they can at least make it a very imperfectly competitive market that they can really mess up the workplace if they were to all quit. You wouldn't want to run an assembly line for 20 people with just 3 people on it. You wouldn't want to run a restaurant that's, used to having 5 waiters if you only have 1 waiter. See, the logic of it all flips around when you start talking about people as a collective. Because while the employer may not need an individual employee, they absolutely need employees. They have to have a workforce if any work is going to get done. Because that employer has to have profits because that's how they make their living. And so now the demand for labor becomes very inelastic. And at the same time, the workforce ultimately could leave. Given enough time, they could find jobs elsewhere. But if the employer can't keep a workforce around to pay their own bills, they're going to go out of business. And so this collective bargaining, this tactic where the workers collectively gather together, like, say, investors do in a corporation, and they act with unity, they act as one person to give themselves monopoly power, is going to completely flip the logic of it and make the union well, at least in its ideal state, right? A perfectly uncompetitive union, the more powerful one at the bargaining table. This is a way that workers are going to be able to claw back market power from their employers so that they can negotiate a more equitable deal. Now, workplaces are also what we call closed shop or open shop. Your closed shop employers only deal with unions. The shop, like the workplace, is closed to people who aren't in on the club. Whereas your open shop employers hire both unionized and non-unionized workers. You don't have to be a union to get in a union to get a job there. Now, why would you ever want to run a closed shop as an employer? Well, there's 2 reasons why this might come to be. One is you are legally required to. And there are countries like that, more socialist countries, where if they don't outright require membership in the union, they still give the union the exclusive right to collectively bargain, so that it's whether or not it's closed on paper, it's closed in practice. There are countries too where you are just straight up required to join the union. So that's one reason why you might have closed shops. Another reason would be if a union has managed to somehow sign a contract with the employer promising them that right. Usually, this would imply that either the employer was in a really desperate strait and uh, they had to agree to that even though it's not in their long-term interests. Like the business will go out of business if they don't end a strike soon. Or it can be as part of some kind of power sharing agreement where oftentimes employers actually will prefer dealing with a union because even though the union has more market power, it also kind of cuts down on some of the transaction costs of dealing with individual people. It can smooth over a lot of dissent in the workplace. If the employer views the union less as like some rival or enemy and more as a partner in running the business, you can get a more efficient business. Either way, though, closed shops are illegal in the United States, and they have been since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. In this country, all shops are required to be open shops. They can't kick you out of a workplace because you refuse to go along with what the union wants. Now, on the other hand, you also can't be fired for joining a union. See, this is called the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, and it outlawed what was called yellow dog contracts. Contracts, so named because you had to be a yellow dog, a coward, in order to sign one. The contract says if you join the union, you get terminated. We do not collectively bargain with anyone. Well, these two are illegal. If you want to join a union, they can't fire you. And even if you get laid off because you go on strike, your employer still has to give you preference if they start hiring people again. So, say they downsize, well, they have to take you back later down the line if that's the only reason why you were laid off. But the big takeaway is that in America, nobody can force you to join or not join a union. It's your own personal choice. And this was done as a sort of compromise between labor and capital to end a very ugly social conflict that had been going on since, I'd say, at least the start of the Second Industrial Revolution. We'll be talking about that in a short while. Now, how are unions going to get what they want? How are they going to express their displeasure and put the screws on, the employer to bargain with them? Well, the main tool that they have is the strike. I know you all probably know what strikes are. Striking, you're walking off the job. You say, screw this. I know you need me, so I'm just not going to work until you come to your senses. But the problem is, the employer also knows that you need them too. So striking is really just a battle of wills. Who is more desperate? Who's going to crack first and come begging the other one to take them back? And there's going to be tools that both unions and employers will use to try to win strikes. So, for example, unions build what's called a strike fund. When you join a union, you pay dues into the union. And these dues go towards paying for, the typical stuff, paper at the meeting, whatever fun nonsense, parties they have. But more than anything, the dues are being collected to build up a strike fund, a war chest that when you go on strike, the workers can draw from it to essentially keep getting paid. See, your employer doesn't have to pay you. You go on strike, you're not showing up to work, you're not getting paid for the work you didn't do. But by setting aside part of their funds, saving it up, they can guarantee that all the workers can still live for the duration of the strike. And oftentimes the strike will end when the strike fund runs out. That's one way a lot of strikes end up being resolved. The union blinked first because the union ran out of money. Now, why would we even have a strike fund? Why not leave it up to each individual worker to take care of themselves? Well, one big problem is, remember how I taught you that cartels are only as good as their ability to get everybody on board? That if one person undercuts the cartel, they can steal the cartel's business? Well, with labor unions, it's actually not that bad. One worker can't work 20 shifts in a week, but they but there is still this danger that if enough of your union gives up on the strike, the strike will end. The employer might be a little bit impaired, but it might be worth it to them to tough it out. Now, you might tell everyone, hey, you had better save your money. You had better, be able to get through this thing. But you know how it is. There are always going to be people around who don't do their part, who can't manage their own funds. Left to their own devices, they blow through every penny they have, and they will never be able to save, enough for this. So the union makes it mandatory to guarantee that nobody gets to turn traitor and, break because they got impatient, they didn't want to keep drawing off their own savings, or they already blew through their own savings. The union is going to take their savings and manage it on their behalf. And they pay you out wages. Now, unions are also going to try to unionize entire industries. And the reason why is due to this danger of what you might call substitutability. So in the short term, employers have no real substitute for their workforce. But in the long term, depending on how you want to think of the good, how you want to define it, they do. If people unionize in one factory in one city, that might be a big deal for a while, but in the long term, if it's bad enough, the employer could always move his factory. He could pack up his bags, pack up his machinery, and take it down the road to someplace that does not have a union. This is one of the main reasons why so many businesses outsourced to Asia and to Mexico and to the South back in the 1990s. I don't know that you all would really, that would really mean much to you anymore, but the big backlash to globalization that really found its full expression in the election of Donald Trump, that was a reaction to outsourcing. Outsourcing meaning an American company decides to stop producing in America and instead start producing in some other nation. It's American owned. It goes towards our gross national product, but it's foreigners doing the work. Within the United States, the North ended up getting so heavily unionized, and the unions were so unreasonable in their demands that a lot of these manufacturing companies started moving towards the South. And within America as a whole, a lot of them moved off to Mexico, to Bangladesh, to China. This is a very real problem for a union. It effectively reduces their monopoly power. You might remember how I said that with monopolies. They have this problem in that they can't just jack the price up arbitrarily high. They have to worry about substitutes. Well, the union has to worry about substitute types of labor. Now, they can't control what goes on overseas, although they can lobby for things like protective tariffs. We just make the good more expensive, right? If you make it in China, we're going to tax it more. And so people switch back to our domestically made goods. At that point, the businessman is essentially choosing between higher taxes or higher wages. You force them to pick one or the other. That's the main way you would handle this when they're outsourcing overseas. The main way you handle it domestically is you try to extend the union to take in more people. We really have a big problem if they can just move the factory to the next city over. So let's go ahead and unionize people in the next city over. Just like with tax policy, you take away their ability to run by imposing the same policies everywhere. So it's not good enough for us to have a steelworkers union at this steel mill. We need to have a union for steelworkers everywhere. And in doing so, that gives us even more market power because there's nowhere to run. There's nowhere they can go to get away from the union. And one way that unions are going to help to build themselves up at different workplaces is that they're going to share their strike fund across different workplaces. So they'll pay dues not just towards their own local strike fund, but also towards a national strike fund. Because they know that even if it's only workers at one factory that are struggling at the moment, if that factory's union ends up getting defeated, then production is going to shift towards the ununionized place of work. So unions have to think very strategically. It's not just a matter of winning their own local strikes, but also of knowing when it's worth it to fight a strike at one place and when it's not. They try to spread their money around in such a way as to keep as much of the workforce unionized as possible. Now, on the employer side of things, they're going to rely on what's called scabs. And a scab is either a temporary or a replacement worker. Usually they're just temporary. But the big idea is they're people who are paid higher wages in order to try to break the strike. Now, they're not a permanent solution in a similar way as to how, say, predatory pricing is not a permanent solution. They can't pay the higher wages forever, or it's not worth it to pay the higher wages forever. If you're paying more than what the union's demanding forever, then you might as well just pay the union. But they can bring in the scabs temporarily to extend the strike longer so that the union bleeds its strike fund dry. If we can keep our doors open, if we can continue to operate making a profit, then we can outlast them. Or even if we're taking a loss, if we have some kind of big fixed cost, like it costs us a lot just to pay the property tax on the property, well, we can at least lower our cost. And scabs are going to be hated, especially in your so-called company towns, sometimes big cities that have one major employer, usually a manufacturer. Scabs are going to be hated. Very often, they're not from that town. They're people who are oftentimes imported. The companies will go and recruit in other cities, looking for people who really need a job right now, and they'll bust them in. And they have a right to work. Again, we're open shop in this country, but unions are often going to resort to intimidation and harassment as a way to try to reduce their numbers. So within a workplace, there's always the danger that people will betray the union or will refuse to join the union in the first place. The way you deal with those people is, well, they're traitors, and you treat them like a traitor with the hostility of a traitor. If they don't go on strike, then you're not inviting them to any social functions. You're glaring at them with, the coldest, deepest, bitterest hate every time they walk by. You might play pranks on them, the nasty, mean kind of pranks. You socially exclude scabs as a warning to other people, don't be a scab. And especially when you're talking about a smaller community, like, say, a traditional South Carolina textile mill town, or an Appalachian coal mining town, or a lot of your little towns throughout the Midwest that used to make parts for automobiles. They were manufacturing the automobiles in the big cities, but there would be little like satellite factories in smaller cities that made, say, just mirrors or just alternators or just the engine block. In those kinds of places, that sort of social pressure can be crippling. It can be extremely effective. When you take a stand against the union, you become a pariah. Your kids get bullied in school. Your wife is getting bullied by all the women in the town. Nobody invites you to anything. You can't even go to church because, everyone in the church just glares at you with hatred. But this is not going to work on people from outside. It's not going to work on the strangers that companies like to bring in. Illegals also get used as scabs a lot, right? Immigrants who are willing to work for cheaper. And so what unions would tend to do with them is they would just straight up assault them. They'd beat them up. Now, one common thing that labor unions do is they'll have what's called a picket line. And that's the kind you always see on TV. Everyone's standing out in front of the factory. They're all holding up signs. Usually they're portrayed in a very, sympathetic light. But these people tend to be very rough, especially when you're talking about like old-fashioned blue-collar manufacturing workers. The sort that used to be your average Joes back when America was still, a blue-collar man's country. My pa was a policeman up in Dayton, Ohio. And Dayton, Ohio was an auto town. I don't remember what specific thing they made, but they made parts that went on to the bigger auto plants in places like Detroit and Chicago. And in those days, the union was always striking over something. They had very powerful unions in the North. And every time they would go on strike, every time they would form a picket line, block the gate to the factory, they would have to call out the police. And Pa would get excited because sooner or later, the scabs would show up to work, and you've got this line of men blocking the gate, tough guys, right? Working men. You've got this column of scabs who need to go in to do their job. And there's only one way that you're going to get through the line, and that's to try to push your way through it. And it's technically illegal to block the gate, but the unions, they do this anyways. So your column and your line meet each other, Everyone's glaring at each other. Everyone, they're about to have a showdown. They meet, start to kind of tussle a little bit, and inevitably, somebody is going to swing a fist. Somebody's going to push it a little too far. Somebody is going to try to force their way through. They're going to get socked, and then the whole thing descends into a brawl. And this is where Paul would come in, because Paul loved to brawl. His co-workers had a nickname for him, El Kabong, which none of you would know what that is. I wouldn't know what that is if you hadn't told me the story, but it was an old cartoon character. Ran around, kind of a parody of Zorro. Ran around kabonging people on the head with that guitar. And Paul liked to kabong people on the head with a flashlight. Big, sturdy, heavyweight police flashlight. And that's what he lived for. That was their entertainment in Dayton, was waiting for picket line day, because the union would pick a fight with the scabs, and then the cops would pick a fight with the union and beat them down. And there were no real hard feelings about it, because the union guys knew that the scabs were going to get through. They knew that they were going to lose every time, but the brawl was kind of the point of it. Firstly, just because it made it unattractive to the scabs. It's not going to scare off everyone, but a lot of your weaker-willed men, they're not going to, take a punch to the jaw just to go to work. But that was also good entertainment. Everyone got to go home happy. Everyone got to go to the bar that night and brag about, what a good fighter they were. Except for the scabs, but again, we don't give a shit about the scabs. Now, historically, because I wouldn't want to give you the impression that the unions are the source of all this stuff. Historically, violence would go both ways. And there was a period, let's say roughly 1870 to like 1930-ish. There was a period in American history where violence in the workplace was extremely common. And it was not the labor unions initiating it. Labor unions would try to peacefully organize, and then employers would send in thugs. They'd send in private detectives to beat up the organizers, to kidnap organizers, and even oftentimes to straight up murder organizers. And if you want to watch a really good movie on this, one of your extra credit movies, Matewan, deals with a real world shootout that grew out of this. Yeah, that's a really fun one. One of the best Hollywood shootouts I've ever seen. But yeah, this is happening on both sides. You have the employers trying to break up the unions through force. You have the employees fighting back. And this tradition still carries on to this day. Well, okay. I mean, Paul, it was like back in the late 60s, early 70s when Paul was a cop. I don't know if they still fight like that, but I kind of hope that they do. Now, unions without a closed shop, and this is one of the reasons why unions are so desperate, why they're willing to resort to stuff like that. Unions without a closed shop are threatened by free riding. Just like we talked about free riding back with public goods in the externalities, or sorry, the excludability and rivalry lecture. See, if the union negotiates just for themselves, they make their workers relatively unattractive. I mean, the employer can't refuse to hire a unionized worker just because they're in the union, but if the unionized worker has higher wages or has a different contract, then yeah, they don't have to hire someone on a different contract. The union cannot negotiate just for themselves as long as there are substitute workers in the workplace. But if they negotiate for everyone, nobody has an incentive to pay dues or to strike or to participate. The collective bargaining is essentially a public good. In order for it to be effective, it has to be provided to everyone, which makes it non-excludable. Sorry. No, yeah, that's right. It makes it non-excludable. But at the same time, it's also non-rivalrous. Nobody has any reason to pay into it. Nobody has any reason to go on strike and not earn wages if the union's going to strike on their behalf. Nobody has any reason to go to really boring union meetings and do all their politicking if the union's going to do it on their behalf. And you sure as hell aren't going to pay dues into that strike fund if somebody else is going to do it for you. And so it's very difficult for a labor union to be effective if it doesn't have the force of the state or the force of, again, their fists or the force of a contract backing them up. And because of this, some states allow what's called union security agreements. The union and the employer come to an agreement with each other. They come to a contract that says, hey, we're providing a public good. We're providing a service that benefits all of the workers. And so we ought to be able to collect pay from all of the workers. Just like how a government needs to be able to impose taxes in order to pay for its public goods, things like roads and police and courts, the union is going to have to be able to impose taxes on the workers at that workplace so that even if they're not willing to participate fully, it can at least go in the strike fund. It can at least go towards paying the union bosses and paying the administrative upkeep, forcing these people to pay, part of their own share. And they call these fees agency fees. Now, there are other parts of the country where this is illegal, and that's where your right to work laws come in. So again, at a federal level, you are not allowed to have a closed shop. Nobody can force you to join a union in this country. But in many states, they can force you to pay dues to the union. The union can't drag you out of the factory and make you go on strike with them and stand on that picket line and slug it out with El Kabong, but they can make you pay your share in terms of money. Well, states that are not as friendly to the labor movement, they say, why? Why should a worker's right to choose where they work be constrained in this manner? To a large extent, you tend to find these right to work laws more in the South, which has historically, with the exception of Appalachia, has historically been much more anti-union, much more individualist. And on the other hand, you tend to find these union security agreements much more in the North, which is historically a much more collectivist culture. But hopefully, if you had any confusion about that, maybe cleared it up a bit. The right to work law prevents the union from making you pay dues when you don't want to be part of the union. But even in places that don't have the right to work law, you don't have to join the union, but you do have to pay them tribute. And there is a sound economic reason behind it. Personally, as far as I personally go, I think I'm glad to live in a right to work state. Mostly just because we don't actually have unions as graduate students, but unions are very often political in nature, not just in the sense that they have internal politics, but they also oftentimes they endorse political candidates, and there's no there's no way in hell that any union of like professors is going to endorse a candidate that I like. A union of economists probably would, but a union of professors, like say English professors, sociology professors, people like that, no, not going to happen. And so I'm glad to not have to pay dues towards something like that. Grad students talk about unionizing all the time, but you know, it's never going to happen. We're basically slaves. We're basically slaves because you can't transfer graduate credit like you can undergraduate. Once you're in a program, if you don't finish there, you get nothing. So I have not had an inflation adjustment in like 3 years. This is a natural stopping point. We'll come back.